What if a single missile could ignite a global crisis? President Trump's shocking demands have thrown the world into chaos, fueling an explosive war of words between the US and Russia. But who's telling the truth about Iran's nuclear threat? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking twists. In a world teetering on the edge of geopolitical chaos, a single missile could spark an irreversible chain of events. Imagine, in the dead of night, a massive explosion that reverberates across the globe. This is not a war game. This is a real-world crisis, unfolding in real time. The missile, launched towards Iran, was no ordinary weapon. It was a harbinger of death and destruction, claiming lives and throwing the fragile peace efforts of the United States into disarray. The death toll, already rising by the thousands, was more than just a statistic. It was a grim reminder of the high stakes involved in a game of international diplomacy where the wrong move could mean the difference between peace and full-scale war. But amidst this chaos, a man stands at the heart of the storm: Donald Trump, a president known for his sharp words and unyielding demands. Furious over the situation, he doesn't hesitate to call out the very leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, demanding that the attacks cease. Stop the attacks now, he urges, as the cries of the fallen grow louder, the world holding its breath. For Trump, this is not just a diplomatic issue. This is a moral plea. With every passing hour, more soldiers, more innocents, are falling victim to the fallout of this conflict. Yet, Trump's message remains clear: peace must prevail. And if that peace is not found through negotiation, then the gloves will come off. But what of Russia's role in all of this? Russia, ever the shadow in the background of world politics, was not content to sit idly by. In a powerful speech at the United Nations, Russia's ambassador, Vali Nebenzia, accused the United States and Israel of spreading false information about Iran's nuclear ambitions. An accusation that, if proven true, would shake the very foundations of international trust. According to Nebenzia, the attacks on Iran were not only illegal, but reckless, threatening to unleash a deadly radioactive fallout. These weren't just military strikes. These were actions that could trigger a global disaster, an ecological catastrophe that no one could reverse once it started. But it wasn't just words that Nebenzia used to describe the attacks. It was a call to action. He painted a chilling picture of a world where international law had been disregarded, where the bombs of one nation could justify the suffering of another. According to Russia, Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons, as the US and Israel had claimed. No, they argued, this was nothing more than a smokescreen, a calculated move by the West to justify their aggression. After all, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, had conducted inspections and found no conclusive evidence that Iran was building nuclear arms. Yet the US and Israel continued to push their narrative, citing the dangers that Iran posed to global security, all while fueling the fire of conflict. Then came the bombshell. In the midst of this international back and forth, a startling report from the IAEA emerged, adding fuel to the already blazing fire. While the agency had found no hard proof of nuclear weapons development, it had raised alarms over Iran's uranium enrichment program. At levels reaching 60%, the world was left wondering, what exactly was Iran up to? Was this the first step toward developing weapons of mass destruction? Or was it merely a defensive measure in an environment where every nation was scrambling to gain an edge? But the world wasn't waiting for answers. They were watching, waiting for the next move. The US had made it clear they would not allow Iran to cross the line. But even as the world's superpower took decisive action, the consequences of their interference were far from clear. What they thought was a targeted strike to cripple Iran's nuclear capabilities had instead sparked a firestorm of controversy. Was this truly an act of self-defense, as President Trump and his administration claimed, or had the US crossed a line, overstepping its bounds in a desperate attempt to maintain its dominance? The truth, it seemed, was more elusive than ever. Intelligence agencies within the US were at odds, with military leaders, intelligence officials, and the president himself offering different perspectives on the efficacy of the strikes. While the Pentagon boasted of their success in slowing down Iran's nuclear progress, intelligence reports painted a far more troubling picture. The airstrike, it seemed, had only delayed Iran's progress by a matter of months. And yet, President Trump stood firm, declaring the strikes a resounding success, dismissing any dissenting opinions as politically motivated. His confidence in the outcome was unwavering, but the cracks in the narrative were beginning to show. And the controversy didn't end there. As the situation escalated, a stunning decision was made in Washington. The Trump administration would limit the sharing of sensitive intelligence with Congress, citing national security concerns. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Only days after the announcement, a leaked intelligence report revealed that the airstrikes had not been as effective as the White House had claimed. The revelation caused an uproar, not just among political opponents, but within the ranks of the American government itself. Was this a calculated move to protect the president's image, or was it an attempt to cover up a larger failure? The political fallout was swift. In the Senate, leaders from both parties were outraged. Democrats demanded answers, insisting that the American people deserved transparency. Republicans, though initially supportive of the president's actions, were left questioning whether the administration had overstepped its authority. For many, the leak had shattered the illusion of invincibility surrounding the president. The world was no longer simply watching. They were scrutinizing every move, every decision, with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. Amidst all this, a new and chilling possibility emerged. What if the U.S. wasn't the only one playing with fire? In Israel, a nation that had long viewed Iran's nuclear ambitions with suspicion, there was no room for doubt. Israel had made it clear that any attempt by Iran to develop nuclear weapons would be met with swift, decisive action. But as the conflict escalated, the risks of a direct confrontation between the two nations became more apparent. What would happen if Israel, emboldened by its perceived success, decided to escalate its operations further? And what would the world do if it found itself caught in the crossfire of this volatile, nuclear-armed standoff? These questions, filled with uncertainty and dread, were only the beginning. The clock was ticking, and the world watched in anticipation. The stakes were higher than ever before. Peace seemed an impossible dream, and war, a devastating reality. The future of the Middle East, and perhaps the entire world, hung in the balance. This was no longer just a matter of politics. It was a matter of survival. And as the missiles flew, the world's fate was being decided in real time, one strike at a time. The world was in a state of heightened alert, caught between the forces of diplomacy and the undeniable pull of military action. As the conflict between Israel and Iran raged on, the eyes of the world were fixed on Washington, where the tension was palpable. The U.S. government, under President Donald Trump's leadership, was fighting battles on multiple fronts, internationally, politically, and within its own borders. The questions that had begun with a missile strike now spiraled into larger issues about the nature of power, the scope of government control, and the morality of intervention. At the heart of this drama was the increasingly complex relationship between the U.S. and Israel. The two nations, bound by a long history of strategic alliances, were now navigating the dangerous waters of mutual self-interest and political survival. The situation had become a political minefield for Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was not only dealing with the external pressures of a nuclear-armed adversary in Iran, but was also facing a legal battle that threatened to consume him and his country. Netanyahu, whose tenure had seen the region's most volatile periods, now found himself in the center of a storm, charged with corruption in a series of high-profile cases, including accusations of bribery and abuse of power. These cases, which had started as legal battles, soon became political weapons. His every move was scrutinized, every decision questioned. Yet it was not just the Israeli public that was demanding answers. It was the international community that was beginning to hold Netanyahu's government accountable. For the first time in recent memory, Israel's actions on the world stage were not met with unanimous support. The U.S., long an unwavering ally, now found itself in an uncomfortable position. President Trump, in a move that shocked many, chose to publicly intervene in Israel's domestic affairs, calling for the end of Netanyahu's trial. In a tweet that sent shockwaves through both the Israeli and American political landscapes, Trump criticized the judicial process, accusing it of being a politically motivated attempt to bring down a wartime hero. This unprecedented move not only stirred anger within Israel, but also triggered a fierce backlash from critics within the U.S., who saw it as an overreach into the legal system of a sovereign nation. Netanyahu's legal troubles were just one piece of the puzzle. The larger geopolitical struggle between Israel and Iran threatened to overshadow everything. The military strikes on Iranian soil, which had been presented as defensive actions, now seemed less like strategic measures and more like the beginnings of a full-scale regional conflict. With the U.S. taking a more direct role in supporting Israel's operations, the question of whether these attacks were indeed necessary for national security or whether they were politically motivated grew louder. The risk of escalation was ever present, with both Israel and Iran willing to push the limits of what could be justified under the guise of defense. Meanwhile, the global stage was growing more precarious. The United Nations, the body meant to mediate such disputes, had become a battleground in itself, with the two superpowers, Russia and the US, locked in an ideological and strategic standoff. Russia, led by President Vladimir Putin, had been quick to accuse the US and Israel of spreading misinformation about Iran's nuclear program, a move that was as much about challenging American influence as it was about defending Iran. For Russia, this was an opportunity to undermine the US in front of the world. Ambassador Veli Nebenzia, in a scathing speech at the UN, accused the West of using the nuclear issue as a pretext for aggression. His words were a direct challenge not only to the U.S., but to the credibility of the international organizations tasked with overseeing global security. The situation had become one where words could no longer be taken at face value. Every statement, every accusation seemed to be part of a larger, more dangerous game. Nebenzia's speech at the UN painted a grim picture of a world where laws meant to govern international relations were being disregarded, where the idea of collective security had been turned on its head. For Russia, the notion that a sovereign nation's actions could be condemned without solid proof was not only an attack on Iran, it was an attack on the very principles of international law. The accusation that the U.S. and Israel were fabricating evidence to justify their attacks on Iranian soil could not be dismissed lightly. As the U.S. and Israel continued to assert their narrative, the specter of a new Cold War loomed large, with Russia and China standing ready to challenge the U.S.'s global hegemony. At the same time, the unfolding drama in Washington was becoming increasingly fraught. President Trump, desperate to maintain control of the narrative, had begun to clash with his own intelligence agencies. A leaked report from the U.S. intelligence community contradicted the president's assertions about the success of the missile strikes, revealing that Iran's nuclear program had only been delayed by a few months, not destroyed, as Trump had claimed. The leak was a direct blow to the credibility of the administration. The dissonance between the president's public statements and the intelligence community's findings raised profound questions about the relationship between political leadership and the intelligence apparatus in the United States. Was Trump misinformed? Or was he deliberately spinning a narrative to align with his political goals? These questions were no longer just hypothetical. They were being asked by those within his own party, and the answers were becoming harder to ignore. And as if this wasn't enough, another unsettling development occurred. The Trump administration, in an unprecedented move, announced that it would limit the sharing of sensitive intelligence with Congress. This decision, which many saw as an attempt to control the flow of information, sent shockwaves through Washington. Critics were quick to accuse Trump of undermining the checks and balances that are supposed to govern the American system of democracy. The leak of the intelligence report only added fuel to the fire, making the decision to withhold further intelligence appear even more suspicious. As the debate raged on, the rest of the world watched closely. The possibility of a full-blown military conflict between Israel and Iran was growing by the day. But it was not just the military actions that were worrying. The implications of the political battles in Washington, the potential breakdown of international law, and the increasing pressure on global institutions were equally troubling. Would the world's greatest powers be able to avoid the traps of escalation, or were they already too far gone? The coming days would be critical, and the answers would shape the future of international relations for decades to come. In this high stakes game of diplomacy and power, the world was caught between two impossible choices: compromise or war. As tensions continue to rise between world powers, what do you think is the best path forward for achieving lasting peace in the region? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective and engage in a meaningful discussion.